what I'm going to talk about today, and first of all, thanks, Will, for the opportunity to come and speak to you. I'm going to talk about clinical trials and what they mean. How do you find a clinical trial? I think that's kind of a challenging area. What it means to take part in a clinical trial. And I'll just briefly mention some clinical trials that are happening in Brisbane that I know about. So basically, a clinical trial is, the aim of a clinical trial is to find out if a new treatment or procedure is safe and effective. Ultimately, all drugs that are developed or all procedures that are changed are done on an evidence base. So you have to make sure that you do rigid research to make sure that any new change or any new treatment is safe and effective. They're contributed to by lots of different entities, primarily teaching hospitals or universities, research institutions, and the drug companies are obviously often involved in the development of the protocols and the supply of the drugs. Every trial is very strictly regulated these days, and it's really important that that's the case because it makes sure that the protocol is followed the same across the world. So it's important that we have consistency, and therefore a very careful protocol is followed. And before any trial is started, you should all be comfortable with the fact that it's been reviewed by an ethics committee. And so every hospital that's involved in clinical trials has access to an ethics committee, and that's a group of individuals that is responsible for making sure that the trial is appropriate, it's safe, it's the patient is given all of the information they need to decide whether to go ahead or not. I'll just very briefly discuss the clinical drug development process, but just to let you know that it is very long, very complicated, and it can have lots of failures along the way, I guess. So every drug that finally comes onto the market has went through a very long and rigorous process. Most companies or universities will start with thousands of different compounds that they're looking at for a potential drug. And so they have to go through long and rigorous tests in the laboratory before they go anywhere near the patients. They do lots of tests on animal models, lots of tests on samples of tumor types and things like that. So it's definitely a long progress, and lots of compounds don't ever make it past that point. So that's an important part of the process and can take up to 5 years for a drug to come out of that process as a potential. At that stage, it'll go into phase 1, or what they often call is first-in-man studies. And these are the studies where it's the first time the drug has ever went into a patient or a volunteer. In most cases, in drugs that are being developed outside of the cancer area, these are volunteers. Quite often, backpackers or university students that want to make a few dollars and are willing to put their hands up and stay in hospital for a week while they have some rigorous testing. These first-in-man trials are incredibly intensive, they're very well maintained and monitored, and they're always done in a hospital setting so that if there's anything goes wrong, it can be addressed straight away. In the oncology setting, especially in chemotherapies, where the drugs are actually toxic, it's often the case that they'll be used on actual patients. But the understanding for these studies is not that they will be an effective treatment. The point of the studies in a phase 1 setting is really you're looking at to see whether the drug is safe and whether it's well tolerated, and not whether it's effective or not, because ultimately you have to make sure it's safe before you start worrying about whether it works or not. After phase 1, it usually, if it looks good and we're making some progress, it'll make its way into phase 2, and that can take again another few years. More patients this time, always in a patient cohort, and you're looking at whether the dose is right, what are the side effects again, but also looking at first signs of efficacy, so first signs to see is it going to work. And then we go into the pivotal studies, which are the big phase 3 studies, which are the ones that the companies and pharmaceutical companies run to make sure that the drug is actually working, that we understand the side effects, and we look at what the outcomes of those studies are to get the drug on the market. So the whole process is very long and very complicated, and as Mark said earlier, the process has been a slow one for melanoma drugs. It's taken a long time to make any progress, and luckily we're now seeing some drugs coming out that are looking effective and potentially worth pursuing further. So why are clinical trials important? Well, ultimately, all trials, and in particular oncology trials, will ultimately lead us to improved treatments for patients. The trials are the only reliable way that doctors and patients can find out about these different treatments. And so because they're done in such a controlled environment, we can really very carefully consider whether they are better than the standard treatment or not. So they'll always tell us always be compared with what the best standard of care is. And so we'll be able to then see whether the new treatments are better than or have less side effects than the current treatments. A new treatment will only become the standard of care after it's proved to be effective and safe in clinical trials and shown to be better than other treatments. And the better could be that it has a much better safety profile, so the side effects are much less, or ultimately it may be better that it's got a longer survival time or a longer time to show progression to a disease. So this is the only standard way we can find out whether a new trial or a new drug is better or not than the standard. And the results of clinical trials today will basically help patients with cancer into the future. So those that are participating in clinical trials now may not be directly benefiting from the trial, but ultimately it is the way that we can work out what's happening in the bigger picture, and then ultimately our treatments get better for the future. It's an amazing, I've worked with lots of patients in clinical trials in oncology, and I'm always very honoured, I guess, to work with them, because a lot of people do recognise the fact that these clinical trials may not actually help them as individuals, but will provide us with information and give the opportunity for future generations to benefit from these trials. There is statistics, however, to show that patients that do participate in clinical trials actually do have better outcomes, and there's reasons for that. So basically, many of the effective treatments we're using today are the outcome of trials of the past. Now, I did want to share with you a few websites that you can access information about clinical trials in Australia, but I want to reiterate first that the importance, I guess, of talking to your doctor or your treating physician or oncologist about trials first. They really are the best ones equipped to understand what's available. They understand your particular clinical representation the best. And so although ultimately it's your decision as to whether to be part of a trial or not, they will also be able to tell you whether there's trials available in their particular practice or whatever. But internet searches, like we're all addicted to Google, so internet searches are absolutely a good way of finding out new information. And these are some of the sites, so I'll just briefly go through them. There's a very new clinical trials website called the Australian Clinical Trials website. This is a new initiative, and it's basically a general clinical trial, so it's not just for oncology studies, but it gives a lot of information about what a clinical trial is all about and what being part of a clinical trial is about. And it's also got information for professionals as well if they need to access. It's got links to important information. And it's also got testimonials from patients that will have some information about the experiences that they've had. So that's an interesting place to be. The Australian government also have an Australian Clinical Cancer Trials website, which is a very useful resource. All clinical trials that are done in Australia are registered with the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is our regulatory authority in Australia. So once a trial is registered with that agency, then it becomes available for listing on these websites. And so you can actually search for a particular type of cancer, and it'll bring up the information about what trials are open in Australia for that cancer and where those trials are. There's also the Australian and New Zealand Clinical Trials Register. A number of years ago, companies and institutions were instructed that all clinical trials that you would like to publish later down the track need to be registered on a publicly accessible website. And this is the Australian and New Zealand version of that. There's an American version as well, but this is the Australian and New Zealand version. And this has all clinical trials that are registered in Australia. And again, you can put in a search for the particular type of cancer, and it'll drop down with what those trials are. And it will also talk about the various inclusion and exclusion criteria for the particular trial. And I'm plugging our website, but there's probably pretty much other institutions that have clinical trials open, actually list them on their website as well. So we list all of the studies that we have open to recruitment, so not those that are closed to recruitment, but those that are looking for participants, we list them on our website. And I'm sure that other hospitals do likewise. So taking part in a clinical trial, the important thing to remember is ask lots of questions. It's really important that you understand your choices. The types of questions that you might consider asking is, what's the usual treatment for my condition? Because you need to know what your options are, so it's good to understand what the normal treatment is. Find out what the purpose of the trial is. Is it for safety? Is it just to work out if the drug is safe or not? Or is it for looking whether it works or not? Find out if the trial is appropriate for you. There's lots of reasons that it might be a trial that you have the condition for, but it doesn't mean that it's appropriate for you. It may be that it requires you to travel to the clinic every week for 12 weeks, and that mightn't be an option because you might live long distances. Or there's lots of reasons why a trial mightn't be the right one for your particular condition. It's also very important to understand, what are my choices here other than a trial and standard treatment? Is there other options? That you have to understand all the options before you can make an informed decision. As I said earlier, every protocol has inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that basically means there's rules that says you have to comply with to make you eligible for the study. So understanding what those is obviously important. And it's very important, obviously, to understand what the possible benefits are, but also what the risks are to participating in all trials. And if there's any costs associated. For the most part, there should be no costs associated, additional costs associated with participating in a trial. But you do need to ask the question so that you're really clear about that from the start. And do I have time to think about it? Needless to say, you should be given time to think about it. These are important decisions, and you need to make them with due care and diligence, and give yourself enough time to have a think about it. Maybe go and talk to your family, maybe talk to a clinician. So it's important that you get that time to think about it, I guess. Will I get to see the results? Quite often not. Often oncology studies in particular take a long time. They can be years and years before the final results are there. So it may be that you will not actually get to see the final publications or the final results until years on into it. But if that's important to you, you need to talk to the doctor about it. Very briefly, I spoke about inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the ones probably that are the most applicable in a cancer setting are what the type of cancer you have is, what the stage and extent of the cancer is. In the age group, there's usually an upper and lower age limit. More often than not, there's a lower age limit for oncology studies. There's other health problems. If you have other health problems, you may not be eligible for the study because there's potential side effects or potential drugs that you might be on that will be contraindicated for the study. You have to know what your previous treatments were, and also how well you are, how well you're going to be able to tolerate it. So there's usually a performance status, which means basically can you tolerate the treatment and the requirements of the study. All of these things are obviously done in consultation with your doctor. This isn't something you have to decide on your own, but it's important that you understand what the process is. The advantages of taking part in a trial. I think it's really interesting to watch patients that are involved in the trial. They feel very proactive. They feel like they're having an active part in their own healthcare, and that's a positive thing, I think. In a randomized trial, there's generally two types of treatments being compared. So there's the standard treatment, which is the best available treatment for your cancer, and the new treatment, the intervention treatment. You can't assume that you're definitely going to get the new treatment, or you can't assume that that's going to be better anyway. That's the whole point of the study, is actually to see whether the new treatment is better, the same, worse than the standard treatment. But at the end of the day, it's being involved in the clinical study itself means you get usually a lot more blood tests, a lot more scans, a lot more visits and rigorous care by the coordinators and the doctors, and you're very closely monitored because all the little changes and the differences need to be captured so that we can see whether the new treatment is better or not once the blind is broken. So all of this close monitoring can actually help you because it can pick up changes in your health sooner than you might have picked it up if you were in your 3-monthly review cycle with your clinician. And again, it is that altruistic approach of thinking about this as a contribution to the future health of patients with cancer. The risks, again, as I said, the new treatment may not be as effective as the standard of care when it all comes out in the wash. And even if it is effective, it may not work for you because, as we all know, we're not all the same. And so our tolerance or our capacity to undertake a different treatment is different. And so some patients will do very well, some patients won't do so well. And so it's important to understand that just because you might be on a treatment that does well for some people doesn't mean it will do for you. You may experience unexpected side effects. I mean, we try to monitor side effects very closely, and we try to predict what type of side effects you will based on earlier studies. But again, in the early phase of drug development, we just don't know, and we're monitoring and watching very closely. So there may be unexpected side effects. You may have to, as I say, travel to the clinic more often. That's quite common. We would often see patients monthly and probably even more often at the early stages of the studies. You have a lot of information to read. It can be a bit overwhelming at times, and that's why it's important that you have plenty of time to have a think about it. But patient information sheets can go on for lots and lots of pages, and we want to make sure that you really understand what's going on and sign with full informed consent. And again, as I said, you may not actually hear about the results until you might see something in the media about them. At the end of the day, you can always withdraw from a clinical trial. It's like every treatment, you have options. You don't have to continue on a clinical trial, and you don't have to say why you want to stop. So that's important to remember. And if you do withdraw, you won't be disadvantaged by doing this. You will find new options for treatment, and that will be discussed, obviously, with your doctor. So the trials in Brisbane, I'm not going to go through each one of them because Mark spoke quite at length about the different drugs that are in development. And just to say that it's important, as I said, to speak to your medical oncologist. It's also important to somewhere to consider is actually talking to the sponsors of the different trials. So we know that there's drugs being developed by GSK, by Roche, by BMS. Those companies are good resources to actually give them a call and say, where are your trials open? All of the websites that I mentioned earlier are a good opportunity. The Princess Alexandra Hospital has a melanoma unit, and they are, I know, doing quite a number of the BRAF studies, the MEC studies, as we are, so the adjuvant studies. So the Gallipoli Medical Research Foundation, in collaboration with the Cyril Gilbert Cancer Centre, is also involved in the BRAF studies, the MEC inhibitor, BRAF plus MEC, the new BMS study. So there's lots happening. It's a really exciting time in melanoma. We're also involved in immunotherapy. And so I think with all of the information out there, as long as you take the time, have a talk to your doctors, and be well informed, there's lots of things happening. So it's an interesting time. So I might leave it at that, considering we're a little bit behind time. So thank you. Does anybody any questions?
Any questions?
Yes.
It's good to hear that we are thinking of the future when we're doing this, and that's certainly what we did.
Yes.
And it's also interesting to say we might not hear the results for ages. Is there any requirement of the study or the company, I suppose, to inform participants eventually?
There is a requirement that they inform the investigators and also the ethics committee as a final report. As to the individual patients, they won't know who you are. So you're all de-identified. So when we send the data to the companies, it's all de-identified. So there's no personal information being sent. You should really, there is a requirement that they publish the results in a manuscript and they often will present it at international conferences in relation to the scientific field. But in relation to the company informing the patients directly, they won't know who you are.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But why I was thinking of that is you don't know whether a trial was successful or not. It might not have worked for you, but you are,
That's
something good happens.
You would like to know
and
about
it didn't work fully. Does that lead to, you want to know whether you've benefited the whole picture?
Absolutely. And look, they are, these results, even if they aren't successful or they don't show benefit, will be published. It's just they're usually published in scientific journals and presented at academic meetings. So the best person to speak to really is your treating physician, who would be aware of what those publications are. Although you might be able to Google it and see as well, so you'd never know. Oh, sure. So the Centre for Immune and Targeted Therapy, which is a group that has been working in immunotherapy at the Gallipoli Medical Research Foundation and Greenslopes Hospital. Dr. Andrew Nichols' group is working with us. He's been working on immunotherapy for a number of years. And we are starting and concentrating more recently in the melanoma space. Andrew, again, it's a bit like what Mark was saying, is the dendritic cell vaccine therapy and combining it with standard chemotherapy for the treatment of melanoma. The new trial that's coming up is a safety study with photomustine, and so it's going to be added to as a treatment option for patients, an open label, so all patients will be treated with the immunotherapy vaccine plus photomustine for, I think it's 10 vaccines altogether, with a scan in the middle to see any progression of the disease. But it's just through ethics committee at our hospital at the moment and is going to the ethics committee of the university, and so it'll be another few months before it started. But when it does, we will have it listed on our website as well. The science of it all does leave me a little bit lost, but I'm more than happy to take your details if you want one of the scientists to give you a call about it.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's
Will.
good. No, it's good.